So what we're going to look at in this video is the whole idea of the costs of the firm and how they are related to the production function. Now, what that simply means is that the output of any firm is determined by the amount of the inputs. In other words, you have your land and your labour, your capital and your enterprise, and you've got these four factors of production, and they are going to cost you a wage, but they're also, or an interest or a rent, but they're also going to give you the output. So before you can work out the costs, you need to know the link between how much labour, for example, or capital is needed for each level of output. So you start with a factor of production, and the factor of production will give you some level of output, and that's the production function. That's saying that's the productivity, if you like, of the workers. But not only will any of the factors of production, let's say labour, give you an output, it will also give you a cost. And so what we need to do is consider the cost and the output. Okay, so that's what this is going to do, and we're going to look at how you build up the cost per unit by considering how many units I need, and therefore how many factors of production, and link that to their costs. So you've got to go behind the cost curves in order to understand how you build those cost curves. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this. So the cost of the firm, then basically the firms change output by changing the amount of factors, and as I say, the production function is usually written in this form, that the output is some function of the land and the labour and the capital and the enterprise. What we tend to do though is we tend to say, well, look, we're going to keep enterprise the same and we're going to keep land the same, because it's a simplifying assumption, and so the only thing that we are changing is the amount of labour and the amount of capital. So you have, in this section, you have two time periods. You have a short run, and that's defined as any time period at which one factor is fixed. So usually what we argue is that we keep capital fixed and we change labour. So if your capital is the fixed factor, how do I get more output? I've just got to put more workers into the firm. Okay, you could do the same. You could say enterprise is fixed and land is fixed if you don't want to simplify the argument by saying we just ignore those. So fixed means that the cost doesn't change with output. But one of the key things to remember here is that the costs can actually change, and they do change. So wages will go up, etc. So don't say that the costs don't change. It's that the fixed costs don't change when output changes. Okay, so that's something to remember when you get to some multi-choice questions. And what we normally assume in the short run is that it is the capital, the machinery of a business, that is fixed, and we just change the labour. So we increase labour, and labour is known as the variable factor, and capital is therefore known as the fixed factor. Okay, in the short run. So variable factors might include, as you see down here, the factory workers, the raw materials. All of those are going to need to increase when you increase the output. But you have fixed factors, and so you have borrowing, you have admin staff, you have buildings, insurance, etc. Those things do not have to change when output changes. But as I just said, remember, the cost might change, and that's the one that they often do in the exam. They say, what happens if the interest rate goes up? It's still a fixed factor. It's still argued to be fixed, because even though the interest rate has gone up, you've just increased the amount of the fixed cost. But it's still a fixed cost, because fixed cost simply means it is fixed in relation to output. So be warned about some multi-choice questions there. The long run, which we're going to come on to in another video, is simply defined as the period in which you can then change all of the factors of production. Okay, so there's another video coming for that. So let's just have a quick look at the terminology, just as we did with revenue, and I'd recommend you look at the revenue video if you haven't done so already. You've always got to consider the total, then the average, and then the marginal. So total product is simply the total amount of output that is produced. So product is output. Okay, so you use all your factors, fixed and variable, put them into the firm. How much output do I get? Total product. Average product is the total divided by the number of units of the variable factor. So in other words, when we add more and more labour into an industry or into a firm rather, the total product is going to go up, but the average product then is that total product divided by the quantity of labour. Marginal product is the change in the total in product when we employ one more or one less variable factor. So what we normally do, and we'll do it now, is we look at what happens when I want to increase my output. I've got a fixed amount of capital and I just put more and more workers into the firm. And this is a table which we'll expand later, but what you say is that here are your factors that are labour, those are the variable factors, they go up. So the 10th worker, so you have 10 workers in your business, those workers are giving you a total output of 50. So the average from here is the total divided by the number of variable factors. So it's the 50 divided by the 10, so you get an average product of 5. When you bring another worker in, the output goes up to 66. So therefore the average is 6, but the marginal is simply the difference between these output levels here. So this is the extra output for the extra worker. And you can do the same for adding more workers. So you would be expected in the exam to possibly complete a table like that as well. And sometimes they don't give you the output here. They start with this one, for example, and you've got the extra, you've got the marginal, and you're meant to realise that the output is the addition to that output from the extra worker. So they might not have the 66 in there, they just give you 50 and 16, and then you've got to work out, well, the output of the 11 workers is actually 66. Okay, so be warned, be ready for those sorts of questions. So the first law that we have to consider is this law of diminishing returns. Now the word return simply means the returns that you get, the output that you get from the factors of production. So it is how much output can be produced by adding more of the factors. Okay, so what this says is, as a firm adds more and more of the variable factor, labour, to the fixed factor, capital, initially what's going to happen is that the workers can start to specialise. So if you add 1 or 2 workers into your business, they're going to be quite productive, and initially maybe even their marginal product is going to rise because they start to specialise in the goods and in the jobs that they're doing. But there will be some point, and that's this law, it's going to start to diminish. In other words, the amount that each factor produces is going to decline at some point. So let's have a look at this table. You can see the total product is going up. The marginal product initially goes up. So over this range here, these extra workers that I brought into my business start to specialize, and so they become more productive. So they each one, the first one can only do 5, let's say, an hour, second one can do 9 an hour, and the third one 10, because they've all specialized. So the marginal product rises, but eventually, and this is the point for the marginal product, the law of diminishing marginal returns would say diminishing marginal returns setting in, marginal product starts to fall. The average product will also rise, and it'll go on rising a bit, but at this point the law of diminishing average returns set in. So it's at 4 workers that the law of diminishing marginal return sets in, and it's at 5 workers the law of diminishing average return sets in. Okay, all right. So what does that look like? So what we do is we put the units of the variable factor here. Now that's, please note that, because if you just put quantity on that axis, that's not right, because we've got the quantity on this axis. Okay, so what we've said just now is law of diminishing marginal returns states that you add more and more of your variable factor. Initially, they start to specialize, and so the marginal product will rise. Then the marginal product starts to fall, but it's still positive. You're still adding, output to your firm, but there will be some stage, possibly here, where your marginal product will go negative. So marginal product rising, marginal product falling, and then marginal product negative. So here you're still adding to your total product. All right, that's important that you get that. So the total product is still going up, but it's going up at a slower rate. Okay, how does that look at? How does that relate then to the total product? Well, as I say, initially your total product here is rising, and it's rising at an increasing rate. But then the marginal product starts to fall down here, but it's still positive. So the total product still continues to rise, but it rises at a decreasing rate. And then you get the amount here, marginal product becomes negative, that's when your total product will fall. So a graph showing that relationship is this one here, where we see the total product is rising. So this is the total output as I keep adding variable factors. It's rising at an increasing rate. Then it's rising but at a slowing rate. And then total product is falling when marginal product has become negative. So you'd need to know that for some multi-choice questions, not many. What about average returns? Well, as I've said to you, this is the table that we've shown before. So this is what your graph looks like. So basically your marginal product is rising, diminishing marginal return sets in at this point, but your average product keeps on rising. And one of the key things to make sure you draw in a diagram here is that the marginal product cuts the average product at its highest point. And that's because of what I'm going to explain now, which is this. That think about this as the average of your scores in some tests. Let's say you've got average score in economics tests of 70%. You're doing well. Then you get a marginal score, and you get a score in your next test of 80%. Well, the 80% is going to take your average up. So the average is going to rise as long as the margin is above it. But as soon as your marginal score, let's say you did another test and you got 50, it's going to pull your average down. And one of the key things that they'll try and trip you up with in the exam is they say something like, if the margin is rising, then the average is rising, but when the margin falls, the marginal product falls, that means the average product will fall. That is not the relationship between these. The relationship is that as long as the margin is above the average, it brings the average up. When the marginal score, the marginal product is below the average, it brings the average down. So please make sure that you don't get tripped up by that in the exam. And so I've put it here for you. The key relationship is that if the marginal is above the average product is rising. Marginal product below average product will fall. So hopefully that's helpful, and you need to know this because in the next video we're going to go on and look at the costs of a business, but they get related to what we're talking about now in terms of the marginal and average and total product.